Hi, I'm Linda Lee, and I'm from the Sewing Workshop Pattern Collection. I reside in Topeka, Kansas, work there as well, but I travel the country teaching fine sewing techniques. And today I'm going to teach you more about really fine sewing techniques. Imagine that you're on a cruise and you want to have a wonderful coat or jacket to cover up either as a bathing suit cover-up or for dinner, and you want something simple and easy and cool and breezy to put on. So you could make yourself a very beautiful sheer silk chiffon or polyester chiffon cover-up. So I'm going to talk about two different techniques today that really represent what you need to know about sewing with silk or sheer fabrics. And one is a French seam, and secondly, we'll talk about a very fine baby hem as well. So you may be using chiffon, maybe georgette, whatever, but it's very slippery, very sheer, and everything has to be very delicate. So on this French seam, you're going to want to set up your sewing machine using either 100% silk thread, or you might use a 2-ply cotton thread. Everything just needs to be lightened up, including the needle. So you want to use a very fine needle, maybe a 65/9 millimeter needle, Microtex, universal. Every machine's a little bit different, so you need to just test and find that combination of stitch length and needle and thread that really works for you. So let's start that seam. The seam starts out by stitching 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge. Now that's a little bit different than your normal 5/8 or whatever other seam allowances there are in the pattern, but this time you need to calculate this pretty well. And 3/8 of an inch is where you start. So it's a straight stitch. Dial that stitch length down to something in the neighborhood of 2.0 or 2.2 or 3. That 2.5 is too long. And then we have a really interesting device called a bird and clamp. There's a clamp that actually clamps to the table, and then it has a bird, or clamp as it's called, and it becomes your third hand. It's that sewing aid that allows you to keep this fabric taut. And now I can take my little trimming scissors, or I could take some applique scissors, some micro serrated scissors, whatever works for you, but the tension is going to allow you to cut this pretty evenly. And you would cut that all the way down as close as you can, about 1/8 of an inch is perfect. If you don't have a bird and clamp, then you want to anchor that somehow. You could tie a little bit of thread at one end and wrap that around some sort of device, anchor it, maybe even a doorknob. I've even done that. So just so that you are able to get some tension between whatever device it is and your work. So you can see that this has been trimmed to about 1/8 of an inch. And the easiest way to encase this is to first press it. So you always want to press on the right side of the fabric, and you're going to want to press the seam one direction, usually away from you, so that you are pressing against the ridge of the seam. And that creates this well of the seam to be really flat and to stand up, so that you can then bring the fabric with the right sides together. And now you can see that little seam. I'm going to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch now a different width of seam. I have a foot on here that is 1/4 of an inch foot. And that makes it so much easier to stitch that perfect 1/4 of an inch. And because it's sheer, then of course I can see that I have the seam allowance on the inside of that seam. And I know that I'm going to encase it. And if by some chance you feel like you're sewing over the little 1/8 inch seam allowance, then of course you can come back in and trim that again. But you just keep folding, and that, because you've pressed it, then that seam allowance just pops right out of there. right, and you can see that this is what it looks like, nicely pressed. Nice little 1/4 inch seam. Everything is perfectly even and all encased, so there are no raw edges. And the garment looks really beautiful both on the outside of the garment and the inside as well. All right, so let's talk about the hems. You determine the hem allowance, whatever that is. They can be a lot or a little, but you want a little something to work with, at least 5/8 of an inch or so. And you're going to start by stay stitching, meaning just stitching through a single layer of fabric, again using the same thread and the same needle that you've used for the French seam. And you stitch on the finished hem allowance, whatever that may be. And then you want to fold this absolutely on that stitching line and press that and stitch really, really close to that edge. 1/16 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, you're wanting something really, really, really fine. So we'll use our handy tool again. And this time we will trim the excess hem allowance, whatever that is, in this case about that 5/8 of an inch. And you want to just trim as close as you can to that stitching. Now I'm using some small little trimming scissors. You could use some applique scissors that have a duckbill arrangement on it, so you're not going to trim through the fabric that you don't want to trim. And sometimes I've even used really long shears, whatever it requires for you to get a really smooth cut. All right, but we're not done yet. We're going to go back to the sewing machine. And this time, I'm going to change presser feet and use the kind of presser foot that has a little bit of an edge to it, a guide to it, and something where you can move the needle position over. This is something you can't press. You just have to really do this with your fingers. There's a lot of manipulation to this. I want to move my needle position over. Now, once the needle position is down, which is very, very important, now I can come along and stitch, maybe for a couple of inches or so. Now I want to give this a little more tension. You see how that's really straight and flat? If you don't leave the needle position down, then it does not want to sew straight. So you'll sew this entire length. And you can see there's already a line of stitching on here, but you won't see that on the right side of the garment. And what we have is on the right side, you have a single row of stitching, and on the wrong side, you do see 2 rows. But without that first row of stay stitching, it's very difficult to get things really folded really well. I want to talk about one little sewing aid that I think is really nice. If by some chance your particular sewing machine is not sewing well and the fabric is not feeding through, maybe you're using a sewing machine that is for embroidery also, so that there's a large opening for the in the feed dogs, for these multi-motion stitches, which your machine might be able to do. But you might have to have a little bit of a stabilizer. So you could use any kind of traditional stabilizer, something that tears away, something that goes away with some heat or water. But I like to use paper, and I actually use the tissue paper that's left over from my regular patterns. You could use some paper like a medical exam paper. Whatever you're using as a stabilizer should work just fine. The other aid that I use a lot in sewing really fine sheer fabrics is a throat plate that has either a single hole to it. Now that's a problem, of course, when you're moving the needle position one way or the other, so you have to be careful. But there are also alternative throat plates that maybe have a little less wide of an opening than for embroidery. So whatever it takes, you should be able to make beautiful French seams and beautiful baby hems and look great in your topper on that cruise.